Hi, Kent and Frankel. It's SK here. We are picking up with the Phantom Tollbooth. We are on chapter 7. If you haven't caught up yet, you can listen to chapters 1 through 3 and chapters 4 through 6 on our YouTube channel. Chapter 7, The Royal Banquet. Right this way. Follow us. Come along. Step lively. Here we go, they shouted, hopping from the wagon and bounding up the broad marble stairway. Milo and Tot followed close behind. It was a strange-looking palace, and if he didn't know better, Milo would have said that it looked exactly like an enormous book, standing on end with its front door in the lower part of the binding, just where they usually placed the publisher's name. Once inside, they hurried down a long hallway, which glittered with crystal chandeliers and echoed with their footsteps. The walls and ceiling were covered with mirrors, whose reflections danced dizzily along with them, and the footmen bowed coldly. "We must be terribly late," gasped the Earl nervously as they reached the tall doors of the banquet hall. It was a vast room, full of people loudly talking and arguing. The lawn table was carefully set with gold plates and linen napkins. An attendant stood behind each chair, and at the center, raised slightly above the others, was a throne covered in crimson cloth. Directly behind, on the wall, was the royal coat of arms, flanked by the flags of Dichinopolis. Milo noticed many of the people he had seen in the marketplace. The letterman was busy explaining to an interested group the history of the W, and off in a corner, the humbug and the spelling bee were arguing fiercely about nothing at all. Officer Shrift wandered through the crowd, suspiciously muttering, "Guilty, guilty, they're all guilty," and on noticing Milo, brightened visibly and commented in passing, "Is it 6 million years already? My, how time flies." Everyone seemed quite grumpy about having to wait for lunch, and they were all relieved to see the tardy guests arrive. "Certainly glad you finally made it, old man," said the humbug, cordially pumping Milo's hand. "As guest of honor, you must choose the menu, of course." "Oh my," he thought, not knowing what to say. "Be quick about it," suggested the spelling bee. "I am famished, Famished. As Milo tried to think, there was an ear-shattering blast of trumpets, entirely off-key, and a page announced to the startled guest, "King Azaz the Unabridged." The king strode through the door and over to the table and settled his great bulk onto the throne, calling irritably, "Places, everyone, take your places." He was the largest man Milo had ever seen, with a great stomach, large piercing eyes, and a gray beard that reached to his waist, a silver signet ring on the little finger of his left hand. He also wore a small crown and a robe with the letters of the alphabet beautifully embroidered all over it. "What have we here?" he said, staring down at Tot and Milo as everyone else took their place. "If you please," said Milo, "my name is Milo, and this is Tot. Thank you very much for inviting us to your banquet, and I think your palace is beautiful." "Exquisite," corrected the Duke. "Lovely," counseled the minister. "Handsome," recommended the Count. "Pretty," hinted the Earl. "Charming," submitted the Undersecretary. "Silence," suggested the King. "Now, young man, what can you do to entertain us? Sing songs, tell stories, compose sonnets, juggle plates, do tumbling tricks? Which is it?" "I can't do any of those things," admitted Milo. Here they are at the banquet. "What an ordinary little boy," commented the king. "Why, my cabinet members can do all sorts of things. The Duke here can make mountains out of molehills. The minister splits hairs. The Count makes hay while the sun shines. The Earl leaves no stone unturned. And the Undersecretary," he finished ominously, "hangs by a thread. Can't you do anything at all?" "I can count to 1,000, offered Milo. "Ard, numbers. Never mention numbers here. Only use them when we absolutely have to," growled Azaz disgustedly. "Now, why don't you and Tot come up here with me, and we'll have some dinner." "Are you ready with the menu?" reminded the humbug. "Well," said Milo, remembering that his mother had always told him to eat lightly when he was a guest, "why don't we have a light meal?" "A light meal it shall be," roared the bud, waving his arms. The waiters rushed in, carrying large serving platters, and set them on the table in front of the king. When he lifted the covers, shafts of brilliant colored light leaped from the plates and bounced around the ceiling, the walls, across the floor, and out the windows. "Not a very substantial meal," said the humbug, rubbing his eyes, "but quite an attractive one. Perhaps you can suggest something a little more filling." The king clapped his hands, the platters were removed, and without thinking, Milo quickly suggested, "Well, in that case, I think we ought to have a square meal of—" "A square meal it is," shouted the humbug again. The king clapped his hands once more, and the waiters reappeared, carrying plates heaped high with steaming squares of all sizes and colors. "Ugh," said the spelling bee, tasting one. "These are awful." No one else seemed to like them very much either, and the humbug got one caught in his throat and almost choked. "Time for the speeches," announced the king as the plates were again removed and everyone looked glum. "You first," he commanded, pointing to Milo. "Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen," started Milo timidly, "I would like to take this opportunity to say that in all the—" "That's quite enough," snapped the king. "Mustn't take all day." "But I'd just begun," objected Milo. "Nuts," bellowed the king. "Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vanilla ice cream," recited the humbug, bouncing up and down quickly. What a strange speech, thought Milo, for he'd heard many in the past and knew that they were supposed to be long and dull. "Hamburgers, corn on the cob, chocolate pudding." "Pudding," said the spelling bee in his turn. "Frankfurter, sour pickle, strawberry jam," shouted Officer Schrift from his chair. Since he was taller sitting than standing, he didn't bother to get up. And so down the line it went, with each guest rising briefly, making a short speech, and then resuming his place. When everyone had finished, the king rose. "Pâte de foie gras, soupe à l'oignon, faisan sous cloche, salad endive, fromage et fruits et demi-tasse," he said carefully, and clapped his hands again. The waiters reappeared immediately, carrying heavy hot trays, which they set on the table. Each one contained the exact words spoken by the various guests, and they all began eating immediately with great gusto. "Dig in," said the king, poking Milo with his elbow and looking disapprovingly at his plate. "I can't say that I think much of your choice." "I didn't know that I was going to have to eat my words," objected Milo. Of course, everyone here does," the king grunted. "You should have made a tastier speech." Milo looked around at everyone busily stuffing himself, and then back at his own unappetizing plate. It certainly didn't look worth eating, and he was so very hungry. "Here, try some somersaults," suggested the duke. "It improves the flavor." "Have a rigmarole," offered the count, passing the breadbasket. "Or a ragamuffin," seconded the minister. "Perhaps you care for a cinnamon bun," suggested the duke. "Why not wait for your just desserts?" mumbled the earl indistinctly, his mouth full of food. "How many times must I tell you not to bite off more than you can chew?" snapped the undersecretary, patting the distressed earl on the back. "In one ear and out the other," scolded the duke, attempting to stuff one of his words through the earl's head. "If it isn't one thing, it's another," chided the minister. "Out of the frying pan and into the fire," shouted the count, burning himself badly. "Well, you don't have to bite my head off," screamed the terrified earl, and flew at the others in a rage. The five of them scuffled wildly under the table. "Stop that at once," thundered Azaz, "or I'll banish the lot of you." "Sorry, excuse me, forgive us." "Pardon, regrets," they apologized in turn, and sat down glaring at each other. The rest of the meal was finished in silence until the king, wiping the gravy stains from his vest, called for dessert. Milo, who had not eaten anything, looked up eagerly. "We're having a special treat today," said the king as the delicious smells of homemade pastry filled the banquet hall. "By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night in the half-bakery to make sure that—" "The half-bakery?" questioned Milo. "Of course, the half-bakery," snapped the king. "Where do you think half-baked ideas come from?" "Now, please don't interrupt. By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night—" "What's a half-baked idea?" asked Milo again. "Will you be quiet?" growled Azaz angrily. But before he could begin again, 3 large serving carts were wheeled into the hall, and everyone jumped up to help himself. They're very tasty, explained the humbug, but they don't always agree with you. Here's one that's very good. He handed it to Milo, and through the icing and nuts, Milo saw that it said, "The earth is flat." People swallowed that one for years, commented the spelling bee, but it's not very popular these days. He picked up a long one that stated, "The moon is made of green cheese," and hungrily bit off the part that said cheese. "Now there's a half-baked idea," he said, smiling. Milo looked at the great assortment of cakes, which were being eaten almost as quickly as anyone could read them. The Count was munching contentedly on, "It never rains but it pours," and the king was busy slicing one that said, "Night air is bad air." "I wouldn't eat too many of those if I were you," advised Tok. "They may look good, but you can get terribly sick of them." "Don't worry," Milo replied. "I'll just wrap one up for later." And he folded his napkin around. Everything happens for the best. Number 8. The Humbug Volunteers. "Couldn't eat another thing," puffed the Duke, clutching his stomach. "Oh my, oh dear," breathed the minister, breathing with great difficulty. Mumbled the Earl, desperately trying to swallow another mouthful. "Thoroughly stuffed," sighed the Count, loosening his belt. "Full up," grunted the undersecretary, reaching for the last cake. As everyone finished, the only sounds to be heard were the creaking of chairs, the pushing of plates, the licking of spoons, and of course, a few words from the humbug. "A delightful repast, delicately prepared and elegantly served," he announced to no one in particular. "A feast of rare bouquet. My compliments to the chef, by all means, my compliments to the chef." Then, with a most distressed look on his face, he turned to Milo and gasped, "Would you kindly fetch me a glass of water? I seem to have a touch of indigestion." "Perhaps you've eaten too much too quickly," Milo remarked sympathetically. "Too much too quickly, too much too quickly," wheezed the uncomfortable Bud between gulps. "To be sure, too much too quickly. I most certainly should have eaten too little too slowly, or too much too slowly, or too little too quickly, or taken all day to eat nothing, or eaten everything in no time at all, or occasionally eaten something any time, or perhaps," and he toppled back exhausted into his chair and continued to mumble indistinctly. "Attention! Let me have your attention," insisted the king, leaping to his feet and pounding the table. The command was entirely unnecessary, for the moment he began to speak, everyone but Milo, Tot, and the distraught Bud rushed from the hall, down the stairs, and out of the palace. "Loyal subjects and friends," continued Azaz, his voice echoing in the almost empty room, "once again on this gala occasion we have—" "Pardon me," coughed Milo as politely as possible, "but everyone has gone." "I was hoping no one would notice," said the king sadly. "It happens every time." "They've all gone to dinner," announced the humbug weakly, "and just as soon as I catch my breath, I shall join them." "That's ridiculous," said Milo. "How can they eat dinner right after a banquet?" "Scandalous," shouted the king. "We'll put a stop to it at once. From now on, by royal command, everyone must eat dinner before the banquet." "But that's just as bad," protested Milo. "You mean just as good," corrected the humbug. "Things which are equally bad are also equally good. Try to look at the bright side of things." "I don't know which side of anything to look at," protested Milo. "Everything is so confusing, and all your words only make things worse." "How true," said the unhappy king, resting his regal chin on his royal fist, as he thought fondly of the old days. "There must be something we can do about it." "Pass a law," the humbug suggested brightly. "We have almost as many laws as words," grumbled the king. "Offer a reward," offered the bug again. The king shook his head and looked sadder and sadder. "Send for help," "drive a bargain," "pull the switch," "file a brief," "lower the boom," "tow the line," "raise the bridge." "Bar the door," shouted the bug, jumping up and down and waving his arms. Then he promptly sat down as the king glanced furiously in his direction. "Perhaps you might allow rhyme and reason to return," said Milo softly, for he had been waiting for just such an opportunity to suggest it. "How nice that would be," said Azaz, straightening up and adjusting his crown. Even if they were a bother at times, things always went so well when they were here. As he spoke, he leaned back on the throne, clasped his hands behind his head, and stared thoughtfully at the ceiling. But I'm afraid it can't be done. Certainly not, it can't be done, repeated the humbug. Why not? Asked Milo. Why not indeed? Exclaimed the bud, who seemed equally at home on either side of an argument. Much too difficult, replied the cane. Of course, emphasized the bud. Much too difficult. You could if you really wanted to, insisted Milo. By all means, if you really wanted to, you could, the humbug agreed. How? Asked Azaz, glaring at the bud. How? Inquired Milo, looking the same way. A simple task, began the humbug, suddenly wishing he were somewhere else. For a brave lad with a stout heart, a steadfast dog, and a serviceable small automobile. Go on, commanded the king. Yes, please, seconded Milo. All that he would have to do, continued the worried bud, is travel through miles of harrowing and hazardous countryside into unknown valleys and uncharted forests, past yawning, trackless wastes until he reached Digitopolis. If, of course, he ever reached there. Then he would have to persuade the mathematician to agree to release the little princesses. And, of course, he'd never agree to anything that you agreed with. And anyway, if he did, you certainly wouldn't agree to it. From there, it's a simple matter of entering the mountains of ignorance, full of perilous pitfalls and ominous overtones, a land to which many venture, but few return, and whose evil demons slither slowly from peak to peak in search of prey. Then an effortless climb up a 2,000-step circular stairway without railings in a high wind at night, for in those mountains it is always night, to the castle in the air. He paused momentarily for breath, then began again. After a pleasant chat with the princesses, all that remains is a leisurely ride back through those chaotic crags whose frightening fiends have sworn to tear any intruder limb from limb and devour him to his belt buckle. And finally, after the long ride back, a triumphal parade, if of course there is anything left to parade, followed by hot chocolate and cookies for everyone. The humbug bowed low and sat down once again, very pleased with himself. I never realized it would be so simple, said the king, stroking his beard and smiling broadly. Quite simple indeed, concurred the bud. It sounds dangerous to me, said Milo. Most dangerous, mumbled the humbug, still trying to be in agreement with everybody. Who will make the journey? Asked Tok, who had been listening very carefully to the humbug's description. A very good question, replied the king, but there is one far more serious problem. What is it? Asked Milo, who was rather unhappy at the turn the conversation had taken. I'm afraid I can tell you that only when you return, cried the king, clapping his hands 3 times. As he did so, the waiters rushed back into the room and quickly cleared away the dishes, the silver, the tablecloth, the table, the chairs, the banquet hall, and the palace, leaving them all suddenly standing in the marketplace. Of course you realize that I would like to make the trip myself, continued Azaz, striding across the square as if nothing had happened. But since it was your idea, you shall have all the honor and fame. But you see, began Milo. Digitopolis will always be grateful, my boy, interrupted the king, throwing one arm around Milo and patting Tok with the other. You will face many dangers on your journey, but fear not, for I have brought you this for your protection. He drew from inside his cape a small, heavy box about the size of a schoolbook and handed it ceremoniously to Milo. In this box are all the words I know, he said. Most of them you will never need. Some you will use constantly. But with them you may ask all the questions which have never been answered, and answer all the questions which have never been asked. All the great books of the past and all the ones yet to come are made with these words. With them there is no obstacle you cannot overcome. All you must learn to do is use them well, and in the right places. Milo accepted the gift with thanks, and the little group walked to the car, still parked at the edge of the square. You will, of course, need a guide, said the king, and since he knows the obstacles so well, the humbug has cheerfully volunteered to accompany you. Now see here, cried the startled bud, for that was the last thing in the world he wanted to do. You will find him dependable, brave, resourceful, and loyal, continued Azaz, and the humbug was so overcome by the flattery that he quite forgot to object again. "I'm sure he'll be a great help," cried Milo, as they drove across the square. "I hope so," thought Tot to himself, for he was far less sure. Good luck, do be careful," shouted the king, and down the road they went. Milo and Tot wondered what strange adventures lay ahead. The humbug speculated on how he'd ever become involved in such a hazardous undertaking, and the crowd waved and cheered wildly. For while they didn't care at all about anyone arriving, they were always very pleased to see someone go. Chapter 9. It's all in how you look at things. Soon all traces of Ditchinopolis had vanished in the distance, and all those strange and unknown lands that lay between the kingdom of words and the kingdom of numbers stretched before them. It was late afternoon, and the dark orange sun floated heavily over the distant mountains. A friendly, cool breeze slapped playfully at the car, and the long shadows stretched out lazily from the trees and bushes. "Ah, the open road," exclaimed the humbug, breathing deeply, for he now seemed happily resigned to the trip. "The spirit of adventure, the lure of the unknown, the thrill of a gallant quest. How very grand indeed." Then, pleased with himself, he folded his arms, sat back, and left at that. In a few more minutes, they had left the open countryside and driven into a dense forest. "This is the scenic route straight ahead to the point of view," announced a rather large road sign. But contrary to its statement, all that could be seen were more trees. As the car rushed along, the trees grew thicker and taller and leafier, until, just as they'd hidden the sky completely, the forest abruptly ended and the road bent itself around a broad promontory. Stretching below, to the left, the right, and straight ahead, as far as anyone could see, lay the rich green landscape through which they'd been traveling. "Remarkable view," announced the humbug, bouncing from the car as if he were responsible for the whole thing. "Isn't it beautiful?" gasped Milo. "Oh, I don't know," answered a strange voice. "It's all in the way you look at things." "I beg your pardon," said Milo, for he didn't see who had spoken. "I said, it's all in how you look at things," repeated the voice. Milo turned around and found himself staring at two very neatly polished brown shoes. For standing directly in front of him, if you can use the word standing for anyone suspended in midair, was another boy just about his age, whose feet were easily 3 feet off the ground. "For instance," continued the boy, "if you happen to like deserts, you might not think this is beautiful at all." "That's true," said the humbug, who didn't like to contradict anyone whose feet were that far off the ground. "For instance," said the boy again, "if Christmas trees were people, and people were Christmas trees, we'd all be chopped down, put up in the living room, and covered with tinsel, while the trees opened our presents." "What does that have to do with it?" asked Milo. "Nothing at all," he answered, "but it's an interesting possibility, don't you think?" "How'd you manage to stand up there?" asked Milo, for this was the subject which most interested him. "I was about to ask you a similar question," answered the boy, "for you must be much older than you look to be standing on the ground." "What do you mean?" Milo asked. "Well," said the boy, "in my family, everyone is born in the air, with his head exactly where it's going to be when he's an adult. And then we all grow toward the ground. When we're fully grown up, or as you can see, grown down, our feet finally touch. Of course, there are a few of us whose feet never reach the ground, no matter how old we get. But I suppose it's the same in every family." He hopped a few steps in the air, skipped back to where he started, and then began again. "You certainly must be very old to have reached the ground already." "Oh, no," said Milo seriously. "In my family, we all start on the ground and grow up, and we never know how far until we actually get there." "What a silly system," the boy laughed. "Then your head keeps changing its height and you always see things in a different way? Why, when you're 15, things won't look at all the way they did when you were 10, and at 20, everything will change again." "I suppose so," replied Milo, for he had never really thought about the matter. "We always see things from the same angle," the boy continued. "It's much less trouble that way. Besides, it makes more sense to grow down and not up. When you're very young, you can never hurt yourself falling down if you're in midair, and you certainly can't get into trouble for stuffing up your shoes or marking the floor that there's nothing to stuff them on, and the floor is 3 feet away. That's very true, thought Tot, who wondered how the dogs in the family liked the arrangement. But there are many other ways to look at things, remarked the boy. For instance, you had orange juice, boiled eggs, toast and jam, and milk for breakfast, he said, turning to Milo. And you are always worried about people wasting time, he said to Tot. And you are almost never right about anything, he said, pointing at the humbug. And when you are, it's usually an accident. A gross exaggeration, protested the furious Bud, who didn't realize that so much was visible to the naked eye. Amazing, gasped Tot. How do you know all that? Asked Milo. Simple, he said proudly. I'm Alec Bings. I see through things. I can see whatever is inside, behind, around, covered by, or subsequent to anything else. In fact, the only thing I can't see is whatever happens to be right in front of my nose. Isn't that a little inconvenient? Asked Milo, whose neck was becoming quite stiff from looking up. It is a little, replied Alex, but it is quite important to know what lies behind things, and the family helps me take care of the rest. My father sees to things, my mother looks after things, my brother sees beyond things, my uncle sees the other side of every question, and my little sister Alice sees under things. How can she see under things if she's all the way up there? Growled the humbug. Well, added Alex, turning a neat cartwheel, whatever she can't see under, she overlooks. Would it be possible for me to see something from up there? Asked Milo politely. You could, said Alex, but only if you tried very hard to look at things as an adult does. Milo tried as hard as he could, and as he did, his feet floated slowly off the ground until he was standing in the air next to Alec Bings. He looked around very quickly, and an instant later crashed back down to earth again. Interesting, wasn't it? Said Alex. Yes, it was, agreed Milo, rubbing his head and dusting himself off. But I think I'll continue to see things as a child. It's not so far to fall. A wise decision, at least for the time being, said Alex. Everyone should have his own point of view. Isn't this everyone's point of view? Asked Tot, looking around curiously. Of course not, replied Alex, sitting himself down on nothing. It's only mine, and you certainly can't always look at things from someone else's point of view. For instance, from here that looks like a bucket of water, he said, pointing to a bucket of water. But from an ant's point of view, it's a vast ocean. From an elephant's, just a cool drink. And to a fish, of course, it's home. So you see, the way you see things depends a great deal on where you look at them from. Now come along, and I'll show you the rest of the forest. He ran quickly through the air, stopping occasionally to beckon Milo, Tot, and the humbug along, and they followed as well as anyone who had to stay on the ground could. Does everyone here grow the way you do? Puffed Milo when he had caught up. Almost everyone, replied Alex, and then he stopped a moment and thought. Now and then, though, someone does begin to grow differently. Instead of down, his feet grow up towards the sky, but we do our best to discourage awkward things like that. What happens to them? Insisted Milo. Oddly enough, they often grow 10 times the size of everyone else, said Alex thoughtfully, and I've heard that they walk among the stars. And with that, he skipped off once again toward the waiting woods. Well, that was chapters 7, 8, and 9 of the Phantom Tollbooth. Join us again later this week where we'll read the next 3 chapters. See you soon.